أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم صل على محمد وآل Muhammad. Welcome to this next installment of lectures devoted to René Guénon's seminal work, The Reign of Quantity and the Science of the Times. Today we have to look at chapter 11, Unity and Simplicity. The moderns are afflicted with a mania for simplification. Indeed, we could say that ours is the age of oversimplification, so much so that any dimension of depth or hint of nuance is conspicuously absent from modern discourse on nearly every topic, whether in the realm of politics and public policy, morals and ethics, and most certainly when it comes to questions which are in their essence of a metaphysical nature. And Guénon addresses this problem with his characteristic profundity, and he has entitled this Unity and Simplicity. He has put the word simplicity in quotation marks for a very good reason. As we learn in our initial study of the science of logic, when we look at the first act of the mind of simple apprehension, we learn that terms have to be well defined, and that terms many times have more than one meaning. So simplicity, when used in reference to God, when we speak of divine simplicity, that is something else than what is being addressed here. Here we have a kind of overturning of the notion of divine simplicity, and if you keep that in mind, then I think you will remain well-oriented in this rather far wide-ranging chapter. The opening sentence. We have seen that a desire for simplification can become illegitimate or pernicious, and that it has become a distinctive feature of the modern mentality. This desire is so strong that certain philosophers have given way to it in the scientific domain and have gone to the length of presenting it as a sort of logical pseudo-principle, in the form of a statement that nature always takes the simplest course. This is a perfectly gratuitous postulate, for there does not seem to be any reason why nature should work in that way and not in any other. Many conditions other than simplicity can enter into its workings and can outweigh simplicity to such an extent that nature seems, at least from our point of view, often to take a course that is extremely complicated. Very well. So, when modern science tries to impose some sort of a notion, and that, mind you, is a misplaced notion of simplicity onto the natural order, this is what Guénon is arguing against. Again, you have to keep in mind the previous chapter where he dwelled at length on the illusion of statistics as well as probability, and how this is a fundamental method in modern science, so that to the degree that modern science is only concerned with empirical observations and empirical accumulation of supposedly identical facts in mass collections and agglomerations, then apply statistical methods to them, this is a complete error. So nature is actually far more complicated than modern science would lead us to believe or would claim. Now, this might strike many people as a very strange thing to say, because, you know, scientists are always talking about the great complexity of the universe, and you know, I don't think anybody out there claims that, you know, science is easy or simple, modern science. But what he is trying to say is that because the very kind of qualitative considerations of which we gave many examples in the previous lecture. We talked about traditional sciences such as astrology, ilm al-jafr in the Islamic tradition, traditional modalities of healing, and so forth. All of that is removed. And so that is the kind of simplification that he's talking about, this misplaced notion of simplicity. Otherwise, if you keep in mind transcendent or principles of a transcendent order, then there is an element of what we may call genuine simplicity in the function of nature, but Guénon does not talk about it. And for example, what you were saying earlier in the previous discussion of the previous chapter about vitalism.
Yeah,
that's an important principle of a transcendent, or has any way rootedness, is rooted in some transcendent principle of the doctrines of the principle of life, namely the soul, which modern science would reject. But there's also something which, again, the modern world doesn't like, and that's really the ideas of Plato. The Platonic ideas, exactly. I should say.
The Platonic forms. The
Platonic forms are ideas, and how they're and how those are manifested in nature.
Right. So,
modern science rejects any notion of design in nature. Now, I am not arguing for. I'm not advocating the design argument as an argument for the proof of the existence of God. It's a perfectly good argument, I think, for many people. But from a strictly metaphysical point of view, there are better ones, and I don't want to get into this. But I do not in any way deny the notion of design in nature. And if you know about traditional sciences like geometry, traditional geometry, the geometry of Euclid, but there are other kinds of geometry which developed paradoxically much later, but also can be applied to the study of nature. And I have in mind, of course, projective geometry. If you don't know about that, please do look it up and look into it. But projective geometry is a very interesting kind of geometry that is, I think, extremely relevant to the study of, in particular, biological form. And there is a very interesting book, which is very much forgotten today. It's called Design in Nature by J. Bell Pettigrew. It's completely out of print. You can only find it, in libraries. And it has a very nice long subtitle, as works written in that period did. This book came out in 1908. It's called Design in Nature, illustrated by spiral and other arrangements in the inorganic and organic kingdoms as exemplified in matter, force, life, growth, rhythms, etc., especially in crystals, plants, and animals, with examples selected from the reproductive, alimentary, respiratory, circulatory, nervous, muscular, osseous, locomotory, and other systems of animals. What a marvelous title. By J. Bell Pettigrew, M.D., medical doctor, LL.D. I'm not sure what that stands for.
Must be some old-fashioned thing.
Well, I don't remember what it is. FRS, so that's Fellow of Royal Society. FRCP, Fellow Royal College of Physicians.
It goes on and on.
Yeah, and he has another book called, which is very interesting, actually, called, you can find these online in PDF. You can't buy them anymore. It's called The Physiology of the Circulation in Plants, in the Lower Animals, and in Man, being a course of lectures delivered at the Surgeons' Hall to the present fellows, etc. of the Royal College of Surgeons of Edinburgh in the summer of 1872. Brilliant. So that's an example of genuine understanding of principles that are very simple, rooted in geometry, which ultimately is a principle of is manifestation then of the Platonic ideas. So if you take simplicity in that sense, then there is something to be. Then there is some justification to say that simplicity is a principle in nature. But if you take it from the point of view of modern science, where their method of simplification is to get rid of these qualitative dimensions, then that is an overturning of genuine simplicity. And genuine simplicity is a reflection of the divine simplicity.
So in other words, it's an inversion on simplicity.
everything is an inversion nowadays, or
Counter-simplicity.
a counter-simplicity, an anti-simplicity. So, Guénon seems to be saying, in the first footnote on page 74, that there was an early indication, shortly before modern times, of this kind of misplaced notion of simplicity, mistaken notion of simplicity in later scholasticism, in the principle enunciated in this Latin phrase, entia non sunt multiplicanda praeter necessitatum, I think is how you pronounce it. Which means that entities are not to be multiplied beyond necessity, or should not be multiplied beyond necessity. My understanding is that this is probably an allusion, I may be wrong here, but to nominalism, where the advocates of nominalism, William of Ockham, Duns Scotus, they were against the proliferation of universals beyond any particular need. You know, they wanted to minimize resort to universals in scholastic investigations. And it seems to me that's what he's referring to. I could be wrong, though. And so then he mentions in this footnote that this adage, like another according to which nihil ist intellectu quod non prius fuerit in sensu, that there is nothing in the intellect that was not first in the senses. So this is like the first instance of what he calls sensualism, or a tendency toward empiricism. And he says that these scholastic adages belong to what he calls the period of decadence of scholasticism. That is, to a time that is in fact, despite current chronology, not so much the end of the Middle Ages as the beginning of modern times. So be that as it may, you know, whatever the historical precursors of this, he locates this in sort of the end of whatever the origins might be. He's singling out this development in the modern mentality of, again, reduction, as he said in the previous chapter, to statistics, to figures, to probability, and that this is a counterfeit of genuine simplicity. Very well. So I think we can move to the next page, because the rest of this is he's just dwelling on again these scholastic notions. There's another footnote here where he's referring to Aquinas and Aquinas' understanding of angels. So I don't know that there's much to be gained here, but at the expense of just skipping over it, I don't really want to do that. So let me just say a couple of words about this as well. So basically he's continuing on onto the next page, arguing against this idea of this fake kind of simplicity in nature. He says that this kind of simplicity may have some sort of place in mathematics, but it's completely misplaced notion of simplicity that is resorted to by philosophers of this kind. And he accuses them of wanting to twist reality to suit, as he says, the convenience of their own understanding and the understanding of the average people of their like. So people who want to go in this quantitative direction really have sort of descended low. Okay, and so then here he adds this footnote, which I would like to explain. So he says, in this connection, the scholastic adage of the decadent period could be contrasted with the conceptions of St. Thomas Aquinas. So he doesn't consider Aquinas to be part of the scholastic decadence. Concerning the angelic state, ubi omne individuum est species infima, which means, every individual is the lowest species. So when you go to the completely radical individual, the individual man, Socrates, the individual in John or Tom, Dick or Harry, and the individual horse, all the way down, that is the lowest that you find in the species. In the logical order of things. It's not that he's a lowly individual, but in other words, the more you go towards individuation, then you are at what is called the infima species in logic. But then when he refers to angels, he means that the differences between angels are not analogous to the individual differences of our world, because individuum there really means specific difference in logic. So each angel is a manifestation of a divine name, and he refers to Hebrew angelology. So the Hebrew angelology is very similar to what you find in Islam. So each angelic name ends in il. Jibra'il, Azra'il, Israfil.
Yeah.
And you have similar name, in Hebrew it's Gavra'el, it's El. And El or Il is maybe an ancient name for God. You find it in Akkadian, Ilu. Anyhow, so I just wanted to explain the footnote. So because in logic you have genus plus specific difference. So when you're talking about the angels, that's what he has in mind. So again, I don't really see that this sheds too much light on his main argument. Genon does have a way of, he does write in a very arcane style. So he sort of gets back to the main thrust of the argument, or gets back to the main theme on page 76. So again, keep in mind simplicity. He's got it in quotes. The wrong kind of simplicity. So here he's talking about that. He says, it is a particularly strange fact that the tendency to simplicity, understood in this sense, together with the tendency to uniformity, which in a sense runs parallel to it, is taken by people whom it affects as striving for unification. But it is really unification upside down, like everything else that is directed toward the domain of pure quantity, or toward the lower and substantial pole of existence. It is thus another example of that sort of caricature of unity that has already been considered from other points of view. Here, he is pointing to Chapter 7, Uniformity Against Unity. So, true unity may be described as simple. This is what he elaborates next. So the divine unity is utterly simple. There is a divine simplicity, by which it means that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not in any way composite, even notionally. So God does not have a genus and a specific difference, because logically, if you want to define something in Aristotelian logic, the best kind of definition is when you give the genus and the specific difference. But God does not come under any genus. He does not have any specific difference. He does not have any species. He does not have a proprium. He does not have a common accident. These things which are studied in logic, he does not have any of those. So he is in no way composite. He is not extended in space, so he cannot be composite. Now the problem is that anything that is spatially extended is composite. And that's why the quest for the atom is a complete waste of time.
Yeah, doesn't he say this somewhere? He
goes on to say that. I'm not reading literally, I'm just explaining now. So he rejects this notion of the indivisible atom, because anything that has extension is potentially, anyway, divisible, even purely in the mind through analysis.
In other words,
into some sort of parts.
Right, and is it extension meaning that it takes up some amount of space, whether you like it or not?
So there is no Cartesian point in any real sense. So in modern physics, we talked about this in the previous chapter. If you this is what they'll do. They'll model a rocket, or you'll shoot an arrow, and you will take its center of mass, and you'll assume it's just a point moving it. That's not how it works.
Yeah.
So there is no such thing.
Do atomists assert that atoms are indivisible?
Well, originally they did.
Okay.
In ancient Greece, they did.
Yeah.
Right. Then that's originally, I think, what the word even meant in Greek, something that isn't divisible, because when they translated it into Arabic, they called it al-juz alladhi la yatajazza, the part which cannot be further divided. And in early Arabic theological texts, it was also called al-jawharul fard, which means the singular or the utterly simple individual, particle.
Right. And Lucretius speaks of the void in which all of them just float around, and he says that the void is indivisible.
Yeah. So he's saying that if you really think of simple, that it can be applied to the divine. So in the next chapter he says, on the other hand, although the principial unity is absolutely indivisible, it can nevertheless be said to be of an extreme complexity, since it contains eminently, that's the key word, all that constitutes the essence or qualitative side of manifested beings when considered from the point of view of a descent into lower degrees. So, if you conceive of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so again, this is our conception, we're trying to understand that in the Islamic tradition and other traditions, like the Platonic tradition, I don't like to use Neoplatonic, I think that's a misnomer, but if you read something like Plato's dialogue, the Parmenides, if you read Plotinus's the Enneads, if you read Proclus's the Elements of Theology, you have a notion of utter simplicity and divine unity or unicity. And that unicity then is reflected in things. It's not that God is multiplied. But to use the language of Ibn Arabi, there are loci of self-manifestation. There are loci in which God's names are reflected. There is a theophany. And so in Islamic metaphysics, they talk about this state of utter simplicity, and that's the divine essence. That's, to use ontological language, what's called al-wujud la bishart. In other words, existence, or utterly non-conditioned existence, so much so that it is even beyond the condition of being non-conditioned. So language even breaks down. Then you have existence as negatively conditioned, and then you have existence as being conditioned by something. In other words, the divine names, to use more theological language in the Islamic tradition. And so that is the one of Plotinus. And Plotinus uses an image of emanation. But he makes it very clear, which is what people forget, that this is just an image to help us understand. And we can't really say anything about the one other than that it is purely good. And so the pure good, by its very nature, emanates or overflows. And so emanation is, sort of a light, the notion of, maybe a luminous imagery, imagery of light or what have you. And this is a way for us to understand. And of course, he has three hypostases. You've got, the world, soul, and I forget how it all goes now.
He equates the good to the sun, and he says that
there's also the analogy of the sun. So you have these ideas there when you talk about divine simplicity, but then that's very different from the simplicity that's being talked about here. But I think it's quite interesting to look at this notion of divine simplicity, because this is something which Christians really... It's actually, Aquinas upholds the divine simplicity. Many Protestant theologians today reject this idea. Yeah. They don't like it. People like William Lane Craig.
Yeah.
And others, because they're committed to the notion of the triune God. And so this notion of divine simplicity, they say, doesn't work. Because that means that God isn't a person, whatever that means in Christian theology. Yeah. Aquinas upholds the divine simplicity, but he says that, Trinity can only be supported by Scripture, and at that point, all rationality gets thrown out the door.
He just throws his hands up and says it's faith.
Yeah, but there's an interesting understanding of this in the Islamic tradition, particularly in the Shi'i tradition by Imam Ali in the Nahj al-Balagha. There's actually two editions I have of the Nahj al-Balagha, which is the Peak of Eloquence, which is a collection of the sermons, letters, correspondence, and wise sayings of the first Shia Imam. So he refers to God in one of these texts, in the sermon number 152 and sermon number 185 of the Nahj al-Balagha, which I think is quite interesting. So in sermon 152, he says, "Praise is due to Allah who points to his existence by his creation and to the temporal origination of his creation by his beginningless eternity, eternitas a parte ante in Latin, and by their mutual similarity, points to him not being similar to anything." So the divine essence and his divine simplicity is not similar to anything. He goes on, "Neither does cognition perceive him, nor does covering veil him, due to the separateness between the maker and the made, the limiter and the limited, the sustainer and the sustained." And here's the key point. He says, "The one, yet without being construed numerically. Al-ahad bila ta'wili adad." The one, yet without being construed numerically. Because if you take one as a number, no quantity,
as a unit.
Exactly. Then by superposition, 1 and 1 is 2. So the unity or unicity of God is not a numerical or arithmetical one. Then in Sermon 185, again, please bear with me, he says, "Praise is due to Allah, whom the senses can neither perceive, nor can perceivable space enclose him." So he has no extension. Wow. Nor can vision see him, so he's not in any direction. Nor can covering veil him. So he's not got some sort of spatial extension that can be used to be a barrier. He points to his non-origination by the temporal origination of his creation, and by the temporal origination of his creation to his existence, and by their mutual similarity, points to him not being similar to anything. He who is true in his promise and exalted above oppressing his servants. He has established equity amongst his creation, and he has instituted justice over them in his commandments, bearing witness to, by the temporal origination of all things, to his beginningless eternity. Eternitas a parte ante in Latin. And bearing witness by that which compels them, in other words, by compels all things, to need him in terms of their ephemerality to his ever-abidingness. He who is one, but without being a number. Wahidun bila adad. So the ancient mathematicians never considered one to be a number. They considered number to be a kind of reflection of unity.
Right.
And that's what we find in the ancient Greek world and in the ancient Islamic world. Even in very late arithmetical texts on arithmetic by someone like Baha'u'ddin al-Amili, as I said, I think in my interview with Ahmad Naqshwani recently, very late text, he says that one is not a number. And Proclus in the Elements of Theology talks about how every number may be conceived of as a unity. So two is a manifold, right? 755 is a manifold, but it is still one. And so you can conceive of conglomerations of things under some principle of organization as constituting a unity, like a dozen eggs, a herd of cows, a battalion of troops, and so on.
Yeah, I think.
And so Proclus says that every manifold partakes of unity in the opening. I'm not going to read it, but it's in the principles of the Elements of Theology. But there is something very strange. And I want to make this point, and then you can jump in. So Imam Ali in Sermon 152 says that God is the one, yet without being construed arithmetically or numerically. And then in Sermon 185, he says he's one without being number. But another one of the Shiite Imams, who comes later, so Ali is the first, then you got Hassan, then Hussein. The son of Hussein is Ali Zainul Abidin. And in his supplications, in supplication number 28, he says, Laka ya ilahi wahdaniyatul adad, which is very paradoxical. Laka ya ilahi wahdaniyatul adad wa malakatul qudratil samad wa fadilatul hawli wal quwwati wa darajatul ului wal rif'ati. I'm just going to take the translation from Wikishia. So, where is this? Ya laka ya ilahi wahdaniyatul adad means to you, my God, or to thee, my God, belongs the unity of number. Strange. And then it goes on and says, and the property of eternal power, the excellence of force and strength, and the degree of sublimity and elevation. But there, laka ya ilahi wahdaniyatul adad. And I mentioned this also in my interview with Naqshbani recently. You know, that to you, oh my God, belongs the unity of number. So, I mean, how do you... So what does that mean? Well, again, it means that all manifolds that can be conceived of as a unity are but a reflection of that. And that divine unity is the unity of all number, yet he is not a number. Very important for understanding divine simplicity.
Yeah. And that made me, you were when you were reading Imam Ali's saying, alayhi salam, when he speaks of the one but not being numerical, he creates a distinct division between those two. It reminded me of the first definition of Book 7 of Euclid.
Okay.
Which is worded very specifically.
Yes.
This is something that we discussed a lot in my math class. He says a unit is that by virtue of which things are called one. He doesn't say that one is a unit.
Exactly.
He doesn't say that. He says a unit is that by virtue of which we call something one. So in other words, we have this concept of the one, the greater one that Imam Ali is speaking of, perhaps, and that we apply that to something that we view as a unit. Right.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And you have these ideas then in geometry as well. So the point is actually a nothing, yet all space is somehow derives from the point. Right? In fact, there was another saying of Imam Ali, al-ilmu nuqtatun katharaha al-juhal or katharaha al-jahilun, which means that all of knowledge is but a mere speck or a mere point, like of ink, a nuqta in calligraphy, and it has been smeared or spread or made multiple by the ignorant. Oddly enough, there is a very interesting text by the Amir Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi, the famous Algerian freedom fighter and scholar of Ibn Arabi, who really had the first edition of Ibn Arabi's great book Al-Futuhat al-Makkiyah printed at his expense. He wrote a treatise on that saying of Imam Ali. It's never been translated, but there are some spiritual writings of Abdul Qadir, Al-Amir Abdul Qadir. You can maybe get that book. So there's an interesting text of this kind. So in geometry you have the point. In Arabic calligraphy you had the letter alif. And alif, if you read Muhyiddin al-Arabi, is not really considered to be a letter. All the letters come from the alif. And that's also very interesting, because if you take the letter alif in the system of abjad, it just equals 1.
Right.
But if you write out the word alif, lam, fa, it's 111. Because fa is 80, lam is 30, and alif is 1, so that adds up to 111, which is a very interesting number.
111.
111.
Yeah.
And that word also has the same value as the word for axis in Arabic, which is qutb. So qaf is 100, ta is 9, ba is 2. And qutb means axis, so the axis never moves. In a circle also, or if you put, it's again a reflection of the nuqta.
It's what surrounds the nuqta.
Everything else goes around it.
Rotates it. Circumambulates, you can say.
So these are, again, examples of traditional sciences and very interesting little correspondences. But to get back, so I suppose you could say that's my commentary on some aspects of this text, where he talks about principial unity and divine unity and the descent or manifestation into lower degrees and orders of manifestation and so forth. So moving right along on page 77, he says, thus it can be seen that simplification follows strictly the descending course. Now using simplification in the profane modern sense.
Perverted sense.
Follows strictly the descending course, which in current terms, as inspired by Cartesian dualism, would be described as leading from spirit towards matter. Cartesian dualism is this idea that there's a mind-body duality.
Right. Body and spirit.
This is a whole big problem and really it has no place in traditional philosophy. And if you're interested in this, you should go and read Edward Feser. He has a book on philosophy of mind. It's a very good treatment of this, and he talks about Cartesian dualism and why it's a problem. So one of the bizarre reverberations of this perverted and profane sense of simplification is in the spiritual domain itself. Genon says, "It is therefore all the more extraordinary that anyone should attempt to apply this kind of simplification to things that belong to the spiritual domain itself, or at least to as much of it as people are still able to conceive, for they go so far as to extend it to religious conceptions as well as to philosophical or scientific conceptions. The most typical example is that of Protestantism, in which simplification takes the form both of an almost complete suppression of rights, together with an attribution of predominance to morality over doctrine, empty moralizing, sentimentality, and so forth. Right. And the doctrine itself becomes more and more simplified and diminished so that it is reduced to almost nothing, or at most to a few rudimentary formulations that anyone can interpret in any way that suits him. Moreover, Protestantism in its many forms is the only religious production of the modern spirit, and it arose at a time when that spirit had not yet come to the point of rejecting all religion, but was on the way toward doing so by virtue of the anti-traditional tendencies which are inherent in it and which really make it what it is. And the end point of this evolution, as it would be called today, religion is replaced by religiosity. That is to say, a vague sentimentality having no real significance. It is this that is acclaimed as progress, and it shows clearly how all normal relations are reversed in the modern mentality. For people try to see in it a spiritualization of religion, as if the spirit were a mere empty frame, or an ideal as nebulous as it is insignificant. And he also talks about how reformers, self-styled reformers, always try to go back to what they call a primitive simplicity. And so that's what you find among the Salafists, who are very much like Protestants in the Muslim world. Right. They always talk about as-Salaf as-Salih, the righteous forebears, and going back to the primitive simplicity of the original Islam, and rejecting all sorts of rites and so forth, especially those associated with what is known as Sufism, the more sort of contemplative disciplines in Islam. Yeah. So I think that's a very beautiful point that he's made, and it's really I'm always astounded at how far Genon could see, because when Genon lived in Egypt at the time, you just use the example of we might as well call it a Protestant Islam, which is Salafism, was not really that big. Certainly not in Egypt. In the 40s, 50s, 30s, no way. But now Salafist and Salafist tendencies have permeated to all far corners of the Muslim world, and even in Shia circles. It's not really Salafism, but it's a kind of juristic, legalist reductionism. Right. Yeah. Where
everything is just reduced to a series of laws and exoteric actions that you do. Precisely. No real internal disposition for it. Precisely. In other words, it's based on it's like Exodus or something. It's just based on fear. Right.
To some extent, I mean, at least on the Shia side, they'll always talk about, the devotion to the family of the Prophet and so forth. But
how much of that really...
In practical terms, they can tell you how to pray and fast and so forth, but they really do not address the internal, really the esoteric dimension, the dimension of gnosis or irfan, in terms of practical suggestions, in terms of a practical measures to be taken. Mm-hmm. They're pretty short on all of that, because most of the jurists are not involved in this, whether they're Sunni, Shi'i, whether they're Ibadi, that's another group. Regardless, that's what you find. It's the same juristic, nomocentric, law-centered, in other words, approach that focuses merely on outward commandments and prohibitions and rituals, and again it gets reduced to mere moralism, sentimentality, and so forth. Yeah, as Genon said. So Genon is very much opposed to this kind of simplicity, again in quotes, and he goes quite far in denouncing it in very strong terms. Some people may not like what he says here, but I'm going to, it's just my job to sort of try and give an exposition of this. But he identifies this tendency towards simplification with democracy, and he is very much opposed to democracy, and he goes so far as to also call it as a kind of idiocy. Here, of course, when he talks about simplicity, he's again referring to simplicity in the domain of religion, this reductionism which we talked about. Mm-hmm. So he says here, this is page 79, another peculiar thing is that modernists of all sorts, taking into account not those of the West alone, but also those of the East, for the latter are in any case merely westernized, while they boast of doctrinal simplicity, as representing progress in the field of religion. They often speak, as if religion ought to have been made for idiots, or at least as if they supposed that the people they are speaking to must inevitably be idiots. Do they really think that by asserting rightly or wrongly that a doctrine is simple, they are suggesting to a man of the most moderate intelligence a valid reason for adopting it? This is in the end no more than a manifestation of the democratic idea, in the light of which, as was said earlier, it is desired that science too shall be within the reach of all. Mm. It is scarcely necessary to remark that these same modernists are always, as a necessary consequence of their attitude, the declared enemies of all esotericism, for it goes without saying that esotericism, which is by definition only the concern of an elect, cannot be simple, so that its negation appears as an obligatory first stage in all attempts at simplification. And you find this, for example, if you want to talk about Islam, especially in the Sunni world today. Some of the most popular people are the people who are most given to simplification. Yasir Qadhi.
Yep.
Omar Suleiman. It's just sentimentality and empty moralizing. Mm-hmm. And then this kind of... even though this guy is actually in some ways rather intelligent. Mm-hmm. And he's read some books and so forth, and he's not sort of like all of the other Salafists. But at the same time, he's committed to these same sort of reductionist principles to the level of sheer idiocy. And I have in mind, of course, Daniel Haqiqatjou. Mm. Women shouldn't go to college or university.
Yeah, these sort
it is a sunnah for a woman. It is a sunnah for a woman to pray in a closet. These are things that he's said.
Crazy claims.
It's highly... I just don't know what to say.
Yeah.
So these are examples of this sort of... And again, all of these guys, they're Salafis. And they're opposed to all these sort of esoteric practices. They're opposed to intercession, tawassul. They're opposed to ziyarat al-qubur, the visiting of saints' tombs.
Yeah.
They're opposed even of tawassul through the imam, certainly. So, and of course their great-grandfather is Ibn Taymiyyah.
Yeah.
And what is Ibn Taymiyyah known for? Ibn Taymiyyah is known for just ranting against philosophy.
Just being a general nuisance.
Sufism and Shias.
Serial refuter,
whatever you want to call him. And he has the dubious distinction of writing a book against logic.
Somehow. Well, you didn't mention another one.
Who?
And it has to do with this idea of simplicity. It's not just him, but a bunch of other people, but Muhammad Hijab and company. Right?
Ali Da'wah and Muhammad Hijab.
The Speaker's Corner crowd, which are doing so-called da'wah to non-Muslims, but what do? And what are they always posting? It's these 10-minute clips in which it's like debate class or something in high school. In a matter of 5 minutes, they tell you why praying 5 times a day is actually really good for you or something. And they reduce it down to 2-3 minute arguments. Like, how can you simplify such a complicated issue as why do you pray 5 times a day?
This is a huge problem. This is a huge problem. Before
even Shias do this as well.
Yeah, there was I remember before the great drama and carnival of the COVID the COVID thing began. I was in the UK. And I remember I was hanging with Sayyid Ammar Naqshwani and Al-Hilli, and we were at somebody's house, And somebody asked me, what's the whole purpose of existence? I said, well, I can answer you, but you're going to have to listen very carefully. It's going to take me...
It's going to take a while.
To answer this. I think, 30 minutes or whatever. But people want... But, he said, just tell me in the most simplest terms. You cannot answer... There are many questions that cannot be answered in a tweet. 140 characters or whatever it is. I'm not on Twitter, alhamdulillah.
Well, they got rid of that limit recently, actually.
Elf mabruk, Allah yaftah alayhim, wallahi. Who cares? My point is that... And there have been other instances where people have asked me a question and say, but you have to explain it like I want you to answer
it like you're talking to a 5-year-old.
It's what he said, to a 6-year-old or a 6th grader or something. And I said
wouldn't talk to a 6-year-old.
That simply doesn't work.
Yeah.
That simply doesn't work. It's like someone who comes, he sees some books lying around and says, "Oh, what is this differential equations? Can you explain that to me?" And you say, "Well, have you done calculus?" He says, "No." "Have you done algebra?" He says, "No." "Have you done geometry?" He says, "No." "Have you done trigonometry?" I cannot explain to you differential equations then.
Yeah,
it's not possible. So similarly, when people ask profound questions of a metaphysical nature, you have to say, well, have you studied logic? And invariably, the vast majority of people have not studied logic. So if they have not studied logic, they don't know what an argument is, they don't know what a major premise is, what a minor premise is, what a syllogism is, what are you going to do?
This is what you did in your... The viewers can, if they haven't seen this, can go to it. There's a playlist called Against the Atheists on our channel.
Yeah.
And I think in the first one you spent... I think maybe the whole lecture just explaining logic.
That's right.
Before you even got into arguments against...
Yeah, that was in Chicago several years back. Yeah.
If somebody asks you, give me like 5 arguments for the existence of God. Have you done logic? No. So then, like you said,
or when they ask you about evil, why is there suffering?
Yeah.
Well, there's an answer to the question.
Yeah.
I think I had a lecture on that as well. So anyhow, this is another dimension of this kind of mania for simplification.
But there's another aspect of simplicity within religion. I remember I was talking to a Protestant friend of mine, and I asked this person, I was like, how do you pray? It was a genuine question. I was genuinely curious. And she had said, I can kind of do it anywhere. I pray while I'm walking. And I was like, okay, interesting. But in my head, I'm thinking that's very problematic to me. At least when I hear that you can kind of just do prayer on a whim if you feel like it. At any point in the day, you can do it while you're tying your shoelaces or walking. I mean, you've taken the significance of prayer out of it. This is another aspect of simplification, that there's no difficulty in any sort of practice. Like he says, when he first brings up Protestantism, he says, what does he say? Where is it?
Negation of
complete
rights.
Suppression of rights.
Rights.
And rights involves an aspect of difficulty. It involves an aspect of, frankly, inconvenience.
Or something.
Yeah, it takes you out of your day. Like when we pray 5 times a day, it's not a question. It doesn't matter what I'm doing.
It
I
stops
have to pray
everything.
Maghrib.
Yeah, it stops everything. So I think many, I had similar experiences, and as a Muslim, I find that very strange. But I think part of the reason is that as Muslims, when we hear the word prayer in English, we think of salah, or the word namaz in Urdu, Persian, Turkish. And that obviously is a very formalized thing. You have to be in a state of ritual purity. You have to face in the direction of Mecca. There's certain set postures, and well known how Muslims pray. But then there's something called dua, but that's supplication. And for Christians, these are all the same thing. And that's done separate from the prayer. And then there's something called dhikr for Muslims, which is the invocation of the divine name. And dhikr actually means mention. It also means remembrance. So if by prayer you mean the constant invocation of the divine name and constantly being aware of Allah at all times, then if that's what you mean by prayer, then walking, talking, tying your shoelaces, fine. But for a Muslim, that's not
salah. That's a supplement.
That's not what is called salah in Islamic legal terminology. The linguistic meaning of a salah is a different thing. But it's technical meaning, and that's what Muslims think of. So that's maybe why you had that kind of reaction. But again, in Protestantism in particular, you just have a kind of amorphousness, because it's not, I mean, in Catholicism or Christian, what's it called, Orthodoxy, Greek Orthodox, Serbian Orthodox,
there is a certain
Ukrainian
element of
Orthodox,
ritual.
there are very formalized rituals.
Exactly.
And those
and even they have the rosary, which is...
Okay, well, that's different. But the rituals, these sacraments, the Mass, cannot be done by anybody.
Exactly.
It has to be done by a priest who has been... I don't know if the word is consecrated, or he's received, whatever, he's taken holy orders,
ordained
or ordained. With all due respect I'm not really sure. With all due respect to the Catholics and the Orthodox, forgive me, I'm not really familiar with the terminology. But the fact is that you need a priest to do that. Protestantism, you don't. Protestantism gets rid of the
any dude can just go up there.
Well, they reject this notion of authority.
Yeah, exactly.
Specifically, the authority of the majesty of the church. Mm-hmm. Okay, so in Islam, the Salafists are sort of similar, right, in as much as even within the Sunni tradition, they reject, for example, the so-called canonical schools of law, or the schools of the 4 or 5 Sunni schools of law. Everything's sort of open to interpretation again. And they're never really quite clear on what the qualifications for that interpretation are. And a lot of these guys, like the people you mentioned, are kind of making it up as they go along. A lot of these YouTube sheikhs and so forth. I mean, to be fair,
the Speaker's Corner
people like Yasir Qadhi don't do that. He's educated in some sort of a tradition, so he has some system, I suppose. But for the most part, they're throwing all of this out.
Yeah.
And they have this notion of bid'ah, or innovation, and so everything they don't like is a reprehensible innovation in the religion, and so forth. But anyway, I think this sort of rounds it up. And then at the end of the chapter on page 80, he returns to the correct notion of simplicity.
The last paragraph?
Yeah, he says there is at any rate one sense in which that expression of primitive simplicity is the expression he has in mind, can find a realistic application, and that is when the indistinction of chaos is in question. So by chaos here, he means chaos as opposed to cosmos, right? Where you have the divine essence about which we cannot really say anything. In Islamic terms, Ibn al-Arabi referred to al-Dhat al-Ilahiyya, the divine essence, as ankarun nakirat, the most indeterminate of indeterminate things. It's a utterly dark thing about which we really cannot know anything. And so, in that sense, you can speak of this kind of primitive simplicity. That again is al-wujud la bishart, utterly non-conditioned being, so much so that it is beyond even the condition of being non-conditioned. But it is that starting point. And it is from that, by way of what Geron calls cyclic laws, that manifestation comes about. It is a continuous, he calls it, recession, or of a descent toward the substantial pole. He says the creation, inasmuch as it is a resolution of chaos, is in a sense instantaneous and is properly the biblical fiat lux. Fiat lux is let there be light, but it is the primordial light itself that is really the origination of the cosmos, and this light is the pure spirit, in which are the essences of all things. Such being its beginning, the manifested world cannot possibly do otherwise than move in a downward direction, getting ever nearer and nearer to materiality. So the metaphysical point here that is being made here is that this complete primitive simplicity in a state of utter chaos, potentially, so to speak, embodies all things. Inasmuch as it is from out of that complete and utter simplicity, because it's like the idea in some Eastern doctrines, like Japanese Buddhism, where they'll give you a blank sheet of paper. Well, there's nothing on that paper, but then you can make anything on that paper because of that. So in a sense, all modalities of existence are
in that
somehow
paper. Yeah. Within that.
prefigured within that indeterminate chaos, or in the Buddhist context, the emptiness of the page. Because they have this whole metaphysics of emptiness,
right.
and a kind of notion of privation, if you like. Maybe privation isn't the right term. The term they use is shunyata, which is translated as emptiness. And in anyway, no, let's not go on that route. So this divine essence, then, and again, it's this idea of it is again the notion of the Platonic forms,
yeah,
that are then reflected and so forth. But then the point that he's making is that if you understand then what primitive simplicity is, once manifestation begins, the further and further you get away from that 0 point, so to speak, temporally speaking, according to cyclical laws, the more and more you will move toward materiality and quantity. That is the key point that he is concluding the chapter with. And that leads into the hatred of secrecy, which is the topic of chapter 12. And so with that, we conclude. Thank you very much for watching. We'll see you at the next lecture.